Okay. The tea rose, tea gown, etc. supplants the mousseline of Kos. The pianola replaces Sappho's barbatos. Christ follows Dionysus. Phallic and ambrosial made way for macerations. Caliban casts out Ariel. All things are a-flowing. Sage Heraclitus says, but a tawdry cheapness shall reign throughout our days. Dove vai per le strade di Roma, sui filobus e i tram in cui la gente ritorna in fretta, o sesso, come ti aspettasse il lavoro paziente, da cui a quest'ora gli altri ricasano? È il primo dopo cena, quando il vento sa di calde miserie familiari, perse nelle 1000 cucine, nelle lunghe strade illuminate, su cui più chiare spiano le stelle. Nel quartiere borghese c'è la pace, di cui ognuno dentro si contenta, anche vilmente, e di cui vorrebbe piena ogni sera la sua esistenza. Ah, essere diverso in un mondo che pure è colpa, significa non essere innocente. Va, scendi lungo le svolte oscure del viale che porta a Trastevere. Ecco, ferma e sconvolta, come dissepolta da un fango e altri evi, a farsi godere da chi può strappare un giorno ancora alla morte e al dolore. Ai tuoi piedi tutta Roma. Certo, le parole sono parole, facile scriverete, ma quando è che crescerai, PPP? Non è giunto l'ora di essere più ricco e maturo, anche se fanciulli sì e sempre grazie a Dio. So che mi odierai per quel che ti scrivo, ma ti ho sempre detto la verità e ti chiedo scusa che invece di coccolarti ricevi queste stupide parole. Te le avevo già dette e ti chiedo perdono. Sono qui, peccato che non vieni. Chissà perché poi, gli amici sono qui per i momenti difficili, te l'ho detto sempre. Sarò qui tutto l'agosto anche. Vorrei avere tue notizie. Sono sempre tua caramente con l'amicizia di sempre. Scrivami qui, Draconizi, Petacci, Marmari. Grazie del telegramma da Londra. Maria Callas. H.D. Winter Poem. Helen, Helen, come home. There was a Helen before there was a war. But who remembers her? One sap, one root. A pact. Ezra Pound. I make a truce with you, Walt Whitman. I have detested you long enough. I come to you as a grown child who has had a pig-headed father. I am old enough now to make friends. It was you that broke the new wood. Now is a time for carving. We have one sap and one root. Let there be commerce between us. Pier Paolo Pasolini. Dear God, deliver us from the thought of tomorrow. Dear God, the idea of power wouldn't exist without the idea of tomorrow. On top of this, without tomorrow, conscience would have no justification. Dear God, let us live like the birds in the sky and the lilies of the fields. There have always been corners that excite me. I turn my corner to my professor's office and sit as he listens professing, handing me books, telling me I am different, special. No, this is not some lurid tale. However, I wonder 15 years later if I would have so willingly and so blindly sipped from his modernistic, poetic cup with what I know now. One sap, one root, and the untoward desire to insert oneself into poetic history, this family tree of madmen and paupers, considering my options while I remain a youngish poet. Allen Ginsberg, a supermarket in California. What thoughts I have of you tonight, Walt Whitman. For I walk down the side streets under the trees with a headache, self-conscious, looking on the full moon. In my hungry fatigue and shopping for images, I went into the neon fruit supermarket, dreaming of your enumerations. What peaches and what penumbras. What families shopping at night, aisles full of husbands, wives in the avocados, babies in the tomatoes, and you, Garcia Lorca. What were you doing down by the watermelons? I saw you, Walt Whitman, childless, lonely old grubber, poking among the meats in the refrigerator and eyeing the grocery boys. I heard you asking a question of each. Who killed the pork chops? What price bananas? Are you my angel? I wandered in and out of the brilliant stacks of cans, following you and followed in my imagination by the store detective. We strode down the open corridors together in our solitary fancy, tasting artichokes, possessing every frozen delicacy, and never passing the cashier. Where are we going, Walt Whitman? The doors close in an hour. Which way does your beard point tonight? I touch your book and dream of our odyssey in the supermarket and feel absurd. Will we walk all night through the solitary streets? The trees add shade to shade, lights out in the houses, we'll both be lonely. Will we stroll dreaming of the lost America, of love, past blue automobiles and driveways, home to our silent cottage? Ah, dear Father Graybeard, lonely old courage teacher, what America did you have when Sharon quit poling his ferry and got out on a smoking bank and stood watching the boat disappear on the black waters of the Lethe? Even the stories we make up have the trappings of culture and prejudice. Just once let me in without a crude joke or a snide reply. The door was open, I swear it. And I push, and I push, and I hit the nose of the quacking boy in my philosophy class, the one who claims poetry expresses nothing, is useless, over-exuberant, feminine. But I am too young to tell him this is exactly why I like it. Poets need one another. Poetry is a coded language born of tradition and instinct, the instincts of tradition and the traditions of instinct. There are two key texts of literary criticism, both American and both written in the latter half of the 20th century, that elucidate this notion of a pact between poets. They were written, of course, by two extremely different scholars, Harold Bloom and Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. Bloom, defender and sacralizer of the Western canon, Sedgwick, disruptor and blasphemer of said canon. Bloom wrote The Anxiety of Influence in 1973. Sedgwick wrote Between Men in 1985. Bloom's text glorifies the filial chain of influence between poets, how the poet must read, misinterpret, and then do better than his predecessors. According to Bloom, this is how poetry emerges, moves forth, changes. Sedgwick also focuses on British literature primarily and unearths a different side of this rivalry between men. The great authors of Western literature, she claims, made pacts that may seem like rivalries, but in fact these rivalries are a form of brotherhood, a homosocial contract that depends on the exclusion of women. The men use their antagonism toward women to bring themselves closer to each other, to bond. Women are used, exchanged, in order to solidify the poetic pact between men. Women are economic rather than social partners. From Bloom's prologue to The Anxiety of Influence, she was in great agony and would have been swallowed up by the sweetness had she not reached a limit and stopped. But the passion went on without her and passed beyond the limit. Sometimes he thought he was about to speak, but the silence continued. He wanted to say, strengthless and female fruit. He goes on to write, for every poet begins, however unconsciously, by rebelling more strongly against the consciousness of death's necessity than all other men and women do. The young citizen of poetry, or ephebe as Athens would have called him, is already the anti-natural, antithetical man. And from his start as a poet, he quests for an impossible object, as his precursor quested before him. Now Sedgwick. In the reflections translated into English as When the Goods Get Together, Luce Irigaray concludes, male homosexuality is the law that regulates the socio-cultural order. Heterosexuality accounts for the assignment of roles in the economy. To begin to describe this relation as having the asymmetry of, to put it roughly, parole to long, is wonderfully pregnant. Her use of it here is not a historically responsive one. Still, it has potential for increasing our ability to register historical difference. Among the things that have changed radically in Western culture over the centuries and vary across cultures about men's genital activity with men are its frequency, its exclusivity, its class associations, its relation to the dominant culture, its ethical status, the degree to which it is seen as defining non-genital aspects of the lives of those who practice it, and perhaps most radically, its association with femininity or masculinity in societies where gender is a profound determinant of power. Its changes are inextricable from the changing shapes of the institutions by which gender and class inequality are structured. To call a bromance by any other name. The bromance, as the possibility on its own, feels hopeful. Attraction, friendship, adoration. What is happening in this conversation between two men, inheritors of poetry? Isn't it also the timing? To be clear, I love both PPP and Pound as artists and poets, but I'm also troubled by something I love. Like many writers who identify as women, I always identified myself with the male protagonists in the books I read, normalized myself into literature, became the androgynous voice, the neutral body of narrative. The side glance, the inside joke, even though you're a fascist, I can bond with you, said no man ever to any woman he wasn't interested in fucking. To cringe? I saved my rage for banana peels and water pistols. HD writes in her diary, Ezra Pound showed up at the nursing home to say he wished the baby was his. I listened to The Phantom by Ontario's shore. I heard the voice arising, demanding bards. Even Pasolini wanted a new lineage, to be a part of the wake, arriving at so many crossroads, as proof, poetry is fodder, poetry is a joke, poetry is an avocation ensconced with the near impossible task of making the local into the mythic. Aldemerini a Pier Paolo Pasolini. Eppure io ti conobbi. Eri un rilievo, un sicuro profilo dentro il tempo, avevi mani per ricominciare, per flettere dentro l'armonia della creta pesante il tuo respiro. Perché la corruzione di parole e della carne dentro il tuo usignolo fu così che rompesti le tue dighe, onnipresente cacciator di frode, ma niente che scalfisca la parola lanciata. Nella storia illuminavi diversi le correnti libagioni, eppur sei grande, che tu solo il male hai assunto ad un ruolo di preghiera. A youth spent reading the work of serious men. My adolescent bookshelves reveal an alarming self-seriousness I'm grateful to have mostly outgrown. 90% of my fantasies involve driving across the American continent in an old jalopy, me as Dean Moriarty, fearless and to be feared. In these stories, the making of poetry requires danger, is a myth-making mechanism, both so new and so old, many will understand. A drag of Ezra Pound. I do have the hair. Ezra Pound was a drag. Ezra Pound was doing a drag. The poet playing poet, the poet playing at insanity. Pasolini playing the attendant pupil. Pasolini playing it straight. Pasolini playing the radical, playing the silent, playing the saint, paying the peasant. Any ideology is insufferable. The only thing I believe in is the thing of language. One sap, one root. They come from the same. Pasolini, confessional poet, Pasolini, auteur, the most public and private, the most public of poets, finger on the buzzer, informative of nothing but private matters, of the heart clouded and shrouded in personae. Hilda Doolittle, in her memoir of Ezra Pound. Mary again asks me to visit them, especially now as there is some hope of having Father with us soon. I wait for letters with the intense apprehension with which I waited almost 50 years ago when Ezra left finally for Europe. Through the years, I have imposed or superimposed this apprehension on other people, other letters. A sort of rigor mortis drove me onward. No, my poetry was not dead, but it was built on or around the crater of an extinct volcano. Not rigor mortis, no. The vine grows more abundantly on those volcanic slopes. Ezra would have destroyed me and the center they called air and crystal of my poetry. Now I'm in a fever of apprehension and excitement. I was separated from my friends, my family, even from America by Ezra. I did not analyze this. When Francis came into my life, I could talk about it, but even so, only superficially. but I read some of her poems that Ezra had loved together with me, chiefly Swinburne. "You read so beautifully," said Frances. Determining factors of heredity and kinship, hours spent in the trenches, perceived similarities. From Amelia Rosselli to PPP. Dice che Bertolucci è geloso della sua poesia. Può darsi che sia vero, può darsi che vi sia un malinteso, diritti scaduti, contratto che penna non vuole far vedere. Comunque trovo che sia bene ristampare, se è legalmente possibile, quel libro che io ho potuto vedere soltanto alcune rare volte. Ti sarei grata se tu volessi intervenire il più gentilmente possibile. Io non ho distissi personali che io sappia con Cusatelli. Se risultasse per caso che lo conosco senza ricordarmene, né con Attilio Bertolucci, né con te. Con te posso avere a volte un atteggiamento un po' critico dell'iperattività, di cui poi non posso dare un giudizio. Penso soltanto che sia giusto un semplice ristampa, se è possibile, senza interferenze. Baci, 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 baci. Amelia. Walt Whitman in By Blue, Ontario's Shore cries out to the future poets of America. He nominates his own heirs. Of all races and eras, these states with veins full of poetical stuff most need poets, and are to have the greatest, and use them the greatest. Their presidents shall not be their common referees so much as their poets shall. Soul of love and tongue of fire, eye to pierce the deepest deeps and sweep the world. Ah, mother, prolific and full in all besides. Yet how long barren, barren? Of these states, the poet is the equable man. Not in him, but off from him, things are grotesque, eccentric, fail to their full returns. Nothing out of its place is good. Nothing in its place is bad. Poetry is friendship. At its core, I mean, or ought to be, poetry offered in friendship. The exchange of books, the exchange of fluids, easily falling for someone, anyone caught reading the same book you're reading, and at the same time. It is Times Square between us, the lights and the sounds. I see Pasolini running towards me, arms out, joyous. He must have just met Sam Delaney. Sam Delaney must have taken him into one of his movie theaters that he likes so much. The two of them buttering up their popcorn, misheard Italian and American whispers through dark and cigarette smoke-filled air. But then in rolls Agnes, and the fourth wall is broken. It is a dream, and I am not privy to these secrets among men. I stand there between them both, making a triangle in which they perhaps can finally fall for each other. They can bond over my clumsiness, the way my hair flops improperly over my eyes, how I eat too much. They can bond at the expense of my vanity. Sedgwick concludes, in the presence of a woman who can be seen as pitiable or contemptible, men are able to exchange power and to confirm each other's value, even in the context of remaining inequalities in their power. In an old college hall, I start crying, once pushed out of the discussion, or was it more of a debate? Told to toughen up by the older female professor, I spend years in the attempt. It was a discussion about an Indigenous American poet, and I am told to toughen up. My reaction should have been something else. I was looking for a pact. Always am. Marianne Moore, the past is the present. Revived bitterness is unnecessary unless one is ignorant. Tomorrow will be yesterday unless you say the days of the week backward. Last week's circus, overflow frames an old grudge. Thus, when you attempt to force the doors and come at the cause of the shouts, you thumb a brass-nailed echo. The erotic is not only sexual, it wants for more. A lot of time is spent trying to break into Robert Frost's cabin. Not a dream, but a walk at dusk with a new friend, the Japanese translator. Something feels off, but I proceed anyway, with him, with it. I'm sitting by a lake with a woman I want to fuck, telling each other how much we like to, well, we prefer to work with women. I feel thrilled and ashamed of my desire, tangible and potent. Isn't this just being homosocial? The past of the poet is littered with men. The men are sheet white and have voices that make lacerations in the cold New England air. The brush underfoot and the sound of game running off. My favorite professor tells me I have a nice walk, as in I am elegant, as in I am ladylike. He gave me everything, really, books, films, this man who wrote memoirs about Spanish prostitutes and hunting in the fields of Michigan. Pound. For 3 years, out of key with his time, he strove to resuscitate the dead art of poetry, to maintain the sublime, in the old sense, wrong from the start. Me and you and I are sitting on Blue Lake shore, eating oversized sandwiches and laughing. My desire overflows as I catch glimpses, arms, eyes, nipples. My desire, too, is homosocial, an aberrant mistake we discuss into the late hour. Tonno vitellato all over your hands and face. You go dip them in the cool water, though not cool enough for this summer heat. All my love songs have haunched women, eating lust. Lust after an ambition afforded to hoarders. A swarm of reflectors. I weasel my way into a pact. Influence has limits, and the limits are in my email contacts. Grazie a tutti. Grazie. Grazie tantissimo al museo, a Luca, a Vasco, a tutti che hanno fatto questa produzione assieme, soprattutto a Olivia per questo libro bellissimo che dovete prendere lì all'entrata. Grazie ancora.